Yeah. People seeing it built live is really important for people's collective understanding. It's crazy. Like if you just have a call with somebody, you're writing it down because it's the best way you can do it, and they're not seeing it, the engagement is just not as high. So it's really important, I think, to have these tools that give you some constraints and make it faster for you so you can have that live experience.
Well, I think you said something really important. It gives you constraints to make you faster. And a lot of times people think constraints, ooh, that sounds uncomfortable. But constraints actually provide us freedom because they give us the way to move forward without having, as you said, all these deviations that kind of throw us off the path. And so those constraints kind of give us the ability to move faster in dialogue. And welcome back to the Money, the Mindset, and the Mentoring podcast. We've got Sam here from Truville. Truville is an amazing way to streamline your processes for process improvement. And not only have I met Sam, I am actually a client of his as well. I took the project on and bought their stuff. And man, I think it's an amazing way to be able to really understand processes. But we're not here to sell everybody on Truville today. What we're really here to do is help people understand the idea of good process management. So Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So first of all, I really want to start picking your brain on the idea of process management. I think process management is a huge element in people's business. What kind of got you excited about it? And then let's dive a little bit more into process management.
Sure. Yeah, what got me excited about it originally was I started studying it and applying it to my work, but then also expanding that and applying to my personal life. So realizing that everything I do can be analyzed in process terms. That could be doing my laundry, organizing my schedule, juggling multiple projects, starting a business. So when I really started to get down to it, it ended up becoming more of a lifestyle than it was just a work thing for me. And I think that's the most exciting part. And when you really start to see everything as process personally and professionally, for me, it opened up my life in a really expansive way. And I like to share that with other people.
Beautiful. It's funny when I look at process, it's one of those things that people can put a big yawner on when they talk about it, when you're outside of process design. But then you start to really think about it and you think, how many things do I actually adhere to a process? And when I do, it becomes super successful. I mean, a simple process, if I get up and I build into my morning routine or my morning process, I'm going to make my bed and I'm going to brush my teeth and I'm going to make the kids lunches and then I'm going to send them out the door and then I'm going to go sit at my desk and I get to work. There's a process right there. And if I adhere to that process, I have success every morning. When I break from that process, so say, for example, I don't make my bed the first thing, maybe I go brush my teeth and then I'll think about making my bed after I make the lunches. And then I'm going to send the kids out the door, hopefully on time. Maybe I get them up a little bit too later. The second I don't adhere to the process, things start to fall apart. And so I think process is fundamental to creating repeat success.
Right. Yeah. And something that's said in the process space that's not as much common knowledge is variation equals cost in process, but also in life. So if you think about the anecdote you just shared, I think it's really critical that people understand every time you add variation, you add thinking power, you have to make different decisions, you have to analyze different data. It just adds cost to whatever process you're talking about. And a lot of people are resistant to the idea that my whole life should be robotic and standardized. They have this fear of that consistency and what it means to constrain them. But you can have variation, you can have chaos in your life. It just costs more. So you have to determine what the ROI is for that cost. Because there's some processes where you want to be creative and flexible, and process allows for that too. It's just going to be a little more expensive. But like you said, if you want to be efficient and you want to keep your cost base low, you have to reduce your variation. And that's in every context universally.
Well, I agree with that so much. And it's funny when I talk to salespeople and I train them on the idea of having scripts and how important scripting is in the sales process. I say, let's just go through an exercise. And you all do this right now to prove a point. So you and I are going to go through a scripting exercise. A lot of people don't believe that they're actually scripted. But I tell people everybody is scripted. And here's how. So we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to say, hello.
Hi there.
How are you?
I'm well today. How are you?
I'm good. See, we both just followed a process. And the reason why that one was really normalized, we use that process every single day. If the first thing you said is something like, I ride a horse instead of how are you, it would kind of break that theme of what is normally assumed as part of the way that we greet each other. So the idea is we all follow processes.
Yeah, process is everything. It's one of my mantras in life. And hopefully one of the takeaways folks will get from this conversation, which is everything in motion can be described in process terms. Even if you only do it one time, it doesn't mean it's not a process when it's happening. So it's a very inclusive domain of expertise, I should say.
Now, the funny thing that is a discussion that always happens is when building a process, do you find designing the process first and then following it is the best way? Or do you think getting out there and doing it and then figuring out, is this the right process as you're doing it, and then adjusting it is the better way? Which are you? Are you the chicken or the egg on that one?
So I'm a little bit in between, and I'll answer this way. There's no such thing as designing a process from scratch. So everything has to be iterated from something that's happening today. Even in the idea you're saying, well, I'm creating a brand new product to meet something that's never been done before. There's still a demand that you're meeting that's a human demand, and it's being met with some alternative process now. There's no such thing as not iterating from a current process. So what I always say is, doing it, you can go out there and do it and experiment. And I think if you have the expertise, then starting there is going to be a better strategy. But if you want to do it smart, you should always look at what is happening now and understanding that process, the current process, and iterating from that space.
I think you actually said something really, really powerful right there, is doing nothing is a process.
Yes.
Like that right there, I think if you wrote that down on somebody's page and said, you know what, here's where you are standing today, whether it's, an ideal of you want to do something like getting healthy by going to the gym or eating healthy or whatever it is, looking at whatever you're doing right now and saying, if you're doing nothing, well, guess what? That's your process today.
Yeah. You are alive 24 hours a day, regardless of what your decisions are. So if you're going to add new process to it, it's got to iterate from something you're doing in the hours you have now. And that could be, like you said, doing nothing, watching TV. People think they're just going to replace unhealthy habits with healthy habits in this example, but you've already got 24 hours of process happening every single day. You have to figure out how to integrate and evolve your process patterns. It's never just adding something to nothing.
That makes total sense, because when you're looking at developing a pattern, when you're talking about a person and you're looking at developing a pattern, it's really interesting to think about the fact that they've been doing that process of nothing for how many years.
Yeah.
And now they have to learn how to break that pattern of going from doing nothing to doing something.
Right? Because a lot of times the doing nothing or conscious breaks or even unconscious breaks, it's integrated into your entire process paradigm.
Interesting. That's really interesting. I like that. I like that a lot.
It's the same in business too. Business is constant moving. Everyone is there doing something. It's not just easy to rip something out and just put something new without considering what is happening today. It's something that's often missed in process work.
So now what we've done is we've really, I think, honed in on the importance of saying, what is the status quo? What are you doing today? And really getting a keen awareness of what that means. And I think, when you were breaking it down, and you certainly do this within a system, you say, like, what are the, that there's three main things that I think you track when you're breaking the different steps within it. Can you kind of give a little sense of what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. So at Truville, we have our own language we recommend people use for process. And it's really based on the 5 W's that we all learned in elementary school of, like, how do you tell a story that other humans can understand, right? So it's the where, what, when, who, and why. So when you're documenting process, the 3 main things we ask people to capture are who's doing it, where is it happening, and what is happening. Those are the 3 things. So when you talk about that in process terms, it's usually an action, it's a system. And the system could be a physical system, physical location. It could be a software system. And then the who, what's the role that's executing it? If you have those 3 critical elements and then you're putting them in order, you have the when, and then you have why if you're doing any sort of analysis. So this is a fundamental human language that we're really recommending. We're not recommending some complicated machine or engineering based language with all these different conventions and shapes and different things you have to learn. It's kind of, if I'm going to tell you a process story, how are you going to understand it? Just like Bob down the hall is going to understand it, or the CO is going to understand it. And it's that basic structure. But yes, those 3 things are critical. And a lot of people, if they're documenting process, they get overwhelmed and they miss the basics. And if you start to miss even some of those basic fundamentals, people have a really hard time tracking the story, especially if it's mixing machines and nonlinear time and people doing things and robots doing things. So that's sort of the highlight of how we recommend you think about process information.
And I think by breaking it down in that way, it really hones in on where some opportunities are, where some gaps are, where some successes are, because you're really going to hone in on, number one, if the who's missing, that could be a big gap. If the who is overloaded with 15 steps, that could be something that is an opportunity. And if the system is, a piece of paper or a, Bob's desk over in accounting, that could be a problem. And then honing in on the action and saying, okay, maybe it's the right who and it's the right system, but maybe it's the wrong action, and being able to pull that out. I think that's a great way of looking at things.
Yeah, and you've got it exactly right. And oftentimes when people write process information down, and that could be, and we all do it. It could be when you're writing for training or you're writing an email to explain something, how you're doing something to somebody. If you forget any of those three things, it very quickly can become untethered. And most people, they just want to write the action. They just want to write, well, I do this, and then I do this, and I do that. But just like if you were teaching a kid how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and you didn't tell them, well, you need a knife, you need to open the jar, you need to have a plate, you need to do these things, so much of the story is missing. You couldn't actually take those instructions to act on them. And then it allows people room for their imagination to create different variation in how the process they're actually interpreting that data. It's like playing a game of telephone. It never ends well for anyone. And it's just how people struggle with this kind of exercise. It can seem fairly simple, but then it gets complicated rather quickly.
So if somebody was starting this process and they literally had a wall and they had a bunch of sticky notes and they're like, okay, I'm going to start writing my process down and trying to put it together. And what would you say is a really good thing for them to do? Obviously, they're looking at, how am I going to start documenting the status quo? What is the first thing that they need to start doing?
Yeah. So most of the time, if you're talking about writing down a process generally, and let's say in the business context, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you have a problem or something that people care about that you're documenting. So like the scope of the process makes sense. Because if you think about trying to say, where am I getting a current baseline, or where am I getting the status quo of the process? It should be in a scope of interest, because you can capture process at anywhere and everywhere. So I think always getting in the room and agreeing, here's the problem we want to solve, and here's the process that likely contains that problem. That's sort of how that starts. But then after that, it's having a conversation at the detail level we were just talking about. And it's really, if you're sticky notes, if you're doing it on paper, it doesn't change the nature of what we just discussed the last few minutes. Make sure you get the who, where it's happening, and what it is. And if you can keep that discipline, it's going to keep you at a detail level that's going to be tangible and practical. So always make sure you're guiding conversations that way.
Now, is there a point in which you start looking at the idea of, making the decision points? Like we always look at it anytime you're following a process, there becomes like I could go to option A or I could go to option B. And how do you start figuring out those kind of points?
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's not like there's so definitely in process, there's just in life, there's actions and decisions. That's it. Or at least that's what we like to say. So like you said, the questions you need to ask to decide whether I'm doing A or B, option one, option two. And when you're figuring that out in process, a lot of times you have to be somewhat aware of it when you're asking people questions. But it usually comes up fairly quickly if you're thinking about it, right? If they say, okay, I do this step and then I accept it. What happens if you don't accept it? I'm doing this step and then I decide to go in door A next. Because people often tell you the happy path if you just let them. If you just say explain the process, they're always going to explain to you the happy path. They don't want to explain to you what happens when the quality check fails, when the audit fails, when it's not approved, when it's denied, when they don't get you the information that you requested. So a lot of times catching those questions in process work, it just takes a little bit of practice and just a little understanding that if there was ever a situation that went one way, it would likely go the other way. And it's probably important to ask. But there's no magic bullet to say, okay, you're going to know to put a question here. You're going to know to put a question there. A lot of times it's just about relevance. And I tell people, if you want a flyby rule, if you think that there's an alternate process path that's going to happen more than 5% of the time, that's probably a good place to put the question or put the decision so you can track it. Otherwise, you could say there's millions of decisions we make, microseconds decisions, right, that you could document, but it's really about relevance.
Yeah, that makes a whole bunch of sense because you're making the main thing. And, if you want to say, here's a, the 5% deviation or something like that, you can throw that on a different graph, but keep the main thing.
Right. Yeah. Because the questions you want to catch are the ones where it is commanding cost or it's commanding time or people's attention. Like, for instance, if you have an approval process and it's getting approved 99% of the time, that's actually something to note, right? Because why do I even need that process there? But if I have an approval process and it's getting denied 50% of the time, you want to know what happens when something gets denied or doesn't get approved or doesn't make it past its toll gate, because that's commanding a lot of your process costs.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now we've got it documented where we say, here's what the status quo looks like. And we got that put together. What happens next?
So what happens next, once you have that base, and this is reality, right? This is the easy part, which is I just have to track what's happening now. Then, depending on what you're trying to do, you can analyze that in a number of directions. The one thing that, like, one of the standard analyses, you can decide what value is being produced by that process today. And that could be in the form of, actually, the value and you're trying to see how much is produced at what cost. It could be, I don't know the value and I'm doing customer journey mapping, for instance. So where is the value in this for the customer? But deriving value from current state processes, people think they know what it is, but it's an extremely insightful exercise, because then you can actually tell, well, out of all this series of, let's say, 50 steps in this process I'm looking at, where's the customer engaged? What is the customer paying for? Getting that common ground is also a good way to flush out problems. But other than that, you can also take that and then you can start using that as design. So I can take that as, I can just now move things around and iterate that current state. If I know I want to make a design and see what the cost is from moving from A to B, I can take that and I can just analyze for pain points because I'm making recommendations or I want to present it. I could use it to validate the problem. So there's a lot of different things you can do in combination. There's a lot of different ways that can evolve, but it usually depends on your project and your context.
It's interesting. And then once, if you're looking at kind of breaking that out and saying, okay, now I've got my baseline project, I've got my system overlay. Is there a really good mechanism to do that overlay of saying what the new and the old looks like to kind of play that together?
So really good way, I think making sure that they're both written in the same language is a good way to make sure they're overlaid. Because a lot of times if you take the baseline in one form of diagramming or another, and then you make the solution fancy and they're not comparable, then you can't compare them. So I think keeping them in the same language is extremely critical. But then other that, if we're talking about visually overlaying them or doing things, there's not like a flyby rule that I have. But I think that especially if you have it in one language and you don't jazz it up, you have it the same as like, I removed this box here, I removed this decision here, you can really track that in a few different mediums. And I think it becomes easier for people to follow the design process.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you take the process in Spanish and then you write it back in Japanese, we're gonna have a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times when you say it like that, it seems so obvious or intuitive. But a lot of times people don't write the requirements in the same way, or they do design and they can't trace it back to anything they had as a current state, of the same subject. So it does make it hard for stakeholders to follow. And then you think, well, this new thing looks incredible, but they can't intuit, well, it's going to take 5 years to build that. And it's going to be like $20 million because where we're coming from is like a snake pit, So
yeah.
it's tough. I always tell people, if you want to be successful, you got to keep things realistic.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got to roadmap to success. There can't be clouds in between of ambiguity. It's got to be, very, very nicely laid out.
Or a roadmap that just is the end, the destination, and there's no map, there's no starting point, there's no baseline of any kind. People do that a lot. And I'm thinking, well, that must look nice, but how do you get there if you don't know where you are?
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. That's actually a really good point, is to say, you've got this system and you point to what the new system is, and then you show, here's what has to happen in order to make that delta occur. I think that's very smart.
Yeah. I mean, as my life as a process consultant, a lot of times people say, I want blockchain, I want this new system, I want AI, I want this, I want that. And I'd say, okay, well, we can do that, but what does your current process cost per unit, by head count, your current systems? What is it? What are you doing today? No idea. Well, then this could be either very lucrative or very expensive. I have no idea.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, I think inherently putting in what the value is of making a change. I think if there really is no higher value for making a change, other than like it reduces a couple steps, people, submitting to the new process is not going to happen, in a way that's, we've done change management many times where you go into a company, you say, this is the greater way, but it's not significant enough to the person who's doing that process to see benefit of making the change. And they inherently, do not make that migration to the new process.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah. Now, one of the things we talked about is the idea of using sticky notes. I know sticky notes for some people is a great thing, and it's a great tool. But if you have kids, I have 3 of them, they come up to your board and they take all those sticky notes and they make themselves look like a monster or something like that. Your process that was so beautiful is now gone. With your talk to me a little bit what you're doing with your company and how that actually takes that sticky note process and makes it into something a little bit more streamlined.
Sure. So our concept was, we wanted to give people the structure and the workflow digitally. so that they could actually have a meeting with participants and track process information live. And today, that's usually done with whiteboards, with stickies, on paper, if it's done at all. A lot of times, this is the hardest types of meetings to do virtually because there's not like a lot of great tools that just let you throw shapes on the page or have the flexibility of that whiteboard type of feeling. So like with all things, if you have that pure flexibility of a whiteboard and sticky notes, you can do a lot. You can do infinite things. But like you said, you have to take a picture, you have to put it into an application eventually. It can take people many hours to actually document that into something structured. So our goal was to kind of give that people all the basic fundamental tools they would need in a live conversation and make the interface easy enough so you could do it live virtually with other participants.
Yeah, and something for me, I find it so critical. I usually do like a Zoom session or whatever, and I've got the board open and I can just create the little squares so we can kind of point at and make adjustments and that sort of thing to make it really easy to create a good workflow. And then they can visually see their workflow and go, "Oh yeah, I can kind of see where we got a little gap here."
Yeah, people seeing it built live is really important for people's collective understanding. It's crazy. Like if you just have a call with somebody, you're writing it down because it's the best way you can do it, and they're not seeing it, the engagement is just not as high. So it's really important, I think, to have these tools that give you some constraints and make it faster for you so you can have that live experience.
Well, I think you said something really important. It gives you constraints to make you faster. And a lot of times people think constraints, ooh, that sounds uncomfortable. But constraints actually provide us freedom because they give us the way to move forward without having, as you said, all these deviations that kind of throw us off the path. And so those constraints kind of give us the ability to move faster in dialogue.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's part of our system. Our system has a very tight opinion, but you have to, because like you said, if you want infinite flexibility, then you have to make a lot more decisions to build out your product. So if you constrain that, then you can move a lot quicker.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and so people to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you? And I know I can say for me, processes and understanding is something really important. Having a slick ability to be able to use that tool, it's been very, very useful for me in my engagement with my clients.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the tool is available. If you want to find us, we're at Truville, Truvle.com. And you can always find me at sam@Truville.com, or you can look me up, Sam Drauschak, on LinkedIn. I'm one of zero other Drauschaks, so it won't be hard to find me.
Perfect. And we'll have that down in the show notes as well. Well, Sam, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. Process is something that's really near and dear to my heart. And it's been amazing going through all the breakdowns of what makes a really good, successful process.
Thanks for having me on. It was a great conversation. Take care.
Beautiful. Thank you. And guys, with that, we will see you guys on the Money Mindset Mentoring podcast. We'll see you on the next one.